All right, so today we're going to talk about igneous rocks. Make sure to stick around because some of these points are going to be important for your midterms and quizzes. They're going to be side questions other than just identification. So, igneous rocks, what are they? Igneous rocks are rocks that form from cooling magma. And this can be from the surface or underground. So, a good example of this is our plutonic and volcanic rocks, which are two main categories. Now, a plutonic rock is an igneous rock that formed underground. They're also known as intrusive rocks because they're inside of the earth and they usually form in magma chambers and things like that. Our other category of rock is our volcanic rock. Now, volcanic rocks, as it sounds like, form in volcanoes, usually in eruptions, but volcanic rocks can also form very close to the surface, not quite on the surface. So they're also known as extrusive rocks because they've been extruded to the surface. Sometimes these rocks can trap gases or they can form glassy-like rocks. Now, to get into more detail, we're going to have to be able to identify one set of things. We've got our textures here, then we got our compositions. So our texture and our composition combined is what we use to define an igneous rock and identify what it is, which is what you'll be doing in today's lab. So the first texture I'm going to talk about is one of those plutonic or intrusive textures. It's called the pegmatitic texture. This is when the crystals are larger than a centimeter. So they're going to be pretty big crystals in these rocks. Now, none of your rock testing kits will be able to fit a rock with a pegmatitic texture. These are going to be really big crystals, so just remember, these aren't going to be in your rock boxes. Next, we got another plutonic texture, phaneritic texture. Phaneritic rocks are going to be more what you see in your rock boxes. A good thing to imagine is something like a granite countertop. Phaneritic rocks have crystals that are visible to the eye, but they're less than a centimeter. These crystals, it's important to notice, they're going to be all interlocking, not like the next rock I'm going to talk about. So, the porphyritic rocks also have crystals, but not necessarily interlocking crystals. Sometimes a porphyritic rock will have large crystals floating in an island of smaller crystals, or sometimes even a matrix of crystals you can't see. Now, once we get into these crystals you can't see, we're going into those volcanic textures. So a porphyritic rock might be either. So, going down that chart, we're going into the aphanitic rocks. Aphanitic rocks are rocks with those crystals you can't see, meaning they cooled really quickly. Unlike our porphyritic rock, where some of them had a time to cool and some of them didn't, being crystallized and not crystallized, an aphanitic rock is going to be completely uncrystallized. These crystals won't be visible to your eyes, although there might be some specks that got picked up by the volcanic eruption or anything like that. Next coming up is our pyroclastic rocks. And these are a lot like our aphanitic rocks. They are formed when an aphanitic lava kind of goes down a slope and it picks up lots of little other rocks. So you can think of this as a concrete. It'll look something like that. And then finally, for our volcanic textures, we have our glassy texture. You can think of that like an arrowhead. It's obsidian usually. And then we also have our vesicular texture. Our vesicular texture is something like a pumice. This is going to be a very light rock because as it was erupting, there is gas trapped in the rock. So, moving on to composition, our second part of identifying an igneous rock. Composition refers to the types of minerals that are in the rock. So, we have our mafic and then we have our felsic minerals. So, our felsic are going to be our light minerals and then our mafic are going to be our dark minerals. And the main thing to know with this is that mafic rocks usually originate from either the oceanic plates or our mantle, and the felsic rocks originate from our crust. When you're identifying these rocks, they can be either mafic or felsic or somewhere in between. Our mafic rocks are always going to be dark rocks, and our felsic rocks are always going to be light coloreds like white or red. So it could look like this or it could look like that. So here we have some examples of dark gray or intermediate, mafic dark intermediate, this is gray, and then felsic light or red. And then on the left, we have these two different categories we talked about earlier, aphanitic or phaneritic. Now, it could be other things. I guess a better way to describe this would be we have our volcanic, and then we have our plutonic. But you can also think of them, typically in this lab, they'll either be aphanitic or phaneritic, with some tricky bits in between. So we have our volcanic rocks. Remember, they have invisible crystals you can't see with the eye. This one, you can't see any of the crystals, and it is mafic, it's dark. And that's part of the way you'll characterize it. You'll call this a volcanic, aphanitic, mafic rock. And then we have, here's an intermediate volcanic rock. If you notice, you can see little crystals in it. So maybe this rock would be better described as a intermediate, not volcanic, but not necessarily aphanitic. This one, well, maybe we could call that one pyroclastic. Pyroclastic. And then over here we have a glassy rock, right? Now the tricky part is this one's a dark one, and maybe the red's a little bit of a hint, but all the felsic rocks, they may be light, but then we haven't really touched this, and we won't touch this in this class, but felsic rocks are mostly made out of SiO2, silicon dioxide, like glass. So this rock right here is felsic despite the dark color. And it's aphanitic, of course, because you can't see the crystals because it's so glassy. And then here we have our plutonic rocks. Now these plutonic rocks, they formed in a magma chamber, and they could be dark or light. It really depends on how close to the top of the magma chamber they are. So they sort by density. So this rock would be less dense than this rock, for instance. So these are plutonic, phaneritic, usually crystallized rocks. So in this example, all of these rocks are phaneritic. They have these little crystals, but you can still see them with the eye, and they're all interlocking. So here we have our mafic phaneritic rock, our intermediate. Keep a note, this is about 50-50 white and dark. And then we have our felsic rocks. So this one's red, or remember, it could be white. Now, the lab will ask you some questions about where these rocks could have formed. Now, this rock, right, it's made out of oceanic plate because it's darker and it's mafic. So remember that. This darker rock formed mostly from an oceanic plate or the mantle. And then if you had asked where this rock formed, for example, well, it's really, really felsic and it's crystallized, right? So it had a long time to form underground. So this rock probably formed right here. You can know just by looking at it, right? So it had a long time to crystallize because you can see the crystals, and it's felsic, meaning it's mainly made out of the crust. So those are the main takeaways when you have to make your interpretations in the lab about kind of where these rocks were created and what types of rocks they are. So just remember, mafic and felsic, volcanic, plutonic, those are the main two categories, our compositions, and then our textures. Great, good luck with the lab, everyone.